Glad to have you here. I know in some of our updates, I've been pretty bullish about where we're going with ACC, with FAA reauthorization, things like that. Hopefully, we won't disappoint today as well. But that's what Annie is for. Annie Russo is going to be joining us today. With our ACC Advocacy Committee, this is our leadership team. It's led by me, Kevin Spitz. I'm with Mead and Hunt. I'm the chair for this year for just a couple more months. My vice chairman is Allie Fields from CMT. We have our young professional liaison, Amanda Sheraton with McFarland Johnson. Our past chair, Michael Higdon with A19 Strategies. Board liaison is Chad Nixon. And of course, there's TJ, who's our staff liaison. And I'm not going to go through all of the next slide, but just know that the advocacy committee is working to try and bring forth the goals and mission of ACC and of the aviation industry, whether it be through regulatory issues or through legislative issues, or even within our industry advocating for different policies to be looked at from our partnering organizations such as ACI, AAAE, AMAC, any of those organizations such as that. We also have a goal to train, and we're so thrilled that the YPs this year were willing to put on a webinar on advocacy so we could all learn a little bit more about what it means to be an advocate within our industry. And then hopefully we're still working on trying to put together programming that will be able to bring us all back together in person so we can all push forward our mission here at ACC to advocate for our industry. So I'm not going to take up a huge amount of time before we get right into things. And we're going to start talking with Annie about what to be expecting about FAA reauthorization and what you might be hearing about a government shutdown. So without further ado, we will introduce her. Annie, who you probably all know at this point, joined ACI NA in April of 2008 and currently serves as the Chief Political and Congressional Strategy Officer. Prior to ACI, Annie served as Legislative Director for Representative Albie Osiris from New Jersey, directing legislative policy and handling the Congressman's Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. And then prior to joining Representative Sires' staff, she served as a senior legislative assistant for Representative Stephen Rothman. Annie is a graduate of Smith College with a degree in government and public policy and also holds a master's degree in national security studies from the Naval War College. Annie Russo, welcome.
All right. Well, thanks for having me, Kevin, and thanks to ACC for another invitation and for all of the coordination that we do behind the scenes sometimes, are actually really a lot of the time for helping echo the voice of airports on Capitol Hill. It's really important, and we really appreciate all of your help.
Of course. So let's get right into it a little bit here, and maybe just for the benefit of all 70 of us on this call, we can just start with what's going on. Where are we? We come back September, all of a sudden we're hearing these words, government shutdown. So tell us a little bit about setting the stage where we're at right now here in September 18th.
Yeah. So there's two different things that need to happen for aviation and airports. So there's the funding of the federal government, which let me talk about that second. And being Annie only has good news, I'm going to start with the good news first. So there's two things that are going to expire on September 30th at the stroke of midnight before it turns October 1st. It's not just that it's the ACINA annual conference. Talk about really terrible timing for us. But there's the expiration of FAA reauthorization authorities. And most importantly, I think the thing for those of you who were around in 2013 and remember when that expired, that's the taxation authorities go away at that point in time if Congress does not renew it. And then the federal funding expires at the same time. So you could really have a really terrible, perfect storm of two expirations of really important legislation. On the FAA reauthorization side, I am not worried about that. We've been talking very closely to Hill staff. I talked to the aviation subcommittee staff last week on the House side, and they are preparing. It's been widely reported they are preparing an extension. They're not giving details about how long that extension will be, and we can get into how that may impact airports later. But all bills having tax authority have to start in the House, and so this extension really needs to start in the House, and it looks like that's going to happen. And I don't see, and they don't see any problems with passing some type of extension of FAA reauthorization under, an easy process in the House called under suspension of the rules. So it'll get a majority vote and then they'll send it to the Senate. And we don't really see any hurdles in the Senate at this point either with passing that extension. So we expect, that to happen pretty quickly here. It could happen as early this week. It might get kicked until next week. But we do expect that to happen. So on the FAA side, again, no worries. On the government funding side, there's all types of politics there. And I'm sure you've been reading about it in the press. I am not as optimistic that there will be a continuing resolution for the federal government. I know Speaker McCarthy has been talking about it in the press, and he's saying he's not worried. He has been saying, there's never any good that comes out of a government shutdown. And, I agree with him on that front. There's usually never anything good that comes out of a government shutdown. But there is a group of House members who are very determined to have a government shutdown, in part because they just don't agree with continuing any type of funding levels where they are today, and they just don't want that to continue. They want there to be significant cuts to the federal budget. And at this point, they could be major obstructionists in the House for having a continuing resolution passed there. Over the weekend, Speaker McCarthy did unveil a short-term funding bill, and already there are close to a dozen no votes just within the Republican conference itself. And the CR makes cuts to the federal budget, so Democrats are not going to support it either. And he just won't. He's only got a 4-vote majority, so he can't really lose very many votes. And right now the count is at 10. It might even be more than that. He just doesn't have the votes to pass that CR, so it doesn't look like they do that. And even if they can pass it, it's dead on arrival in the Senate. So, we still, in terms of Washington, we still have a long way to go to September 30th. But at this point, to be honest, I'm just not optimistic they can get this done. I think we face the shutdown.
Who are the sides that, maybe, I don't know if you know this or not, but who are the sides that are really negotiating here? Is it between House and Senate, House and President, Republicans, Democrats? Any ideas where we're at with that?
So I right now, who's negotiating with themselves? I think the Republican House Conference is negotiating with themselves. And
Sure.
Speaker McCarthy, certainly made a lot of deals to become Speaker. He has yielded a lot of power to committees themselves. Honestly, we have benefited from that in the FAA reauthorization bill passed by the House. We saw a very bipartisan bill, a lot of airport priorities in there. So some of those deals that he made to become Speaker, moving, a lot of power to committees has helped us. But there's other deals that I think have really just empowered certain parts of his caucus. And when you have such a small majority that he has as Speaker, it's really hard. A few members can really control a lot when you can't count on bipartisan legislation. So, in order to appease those 10 members, he's going to have to make significant cuts in continuing funding, and that's going to turn off members of their own party. And then, for some it won't be enough, for others it's too much, and it's certainly going to lose the Democrats. So it's not easy right now. The play is all on the Republican side. There's much more agreement on the Senate side between Leader McConnell and Majority Leader Chuck Schumer. They have been very candid about that. They have been talking. They know where they think the Senate votes are. There's many layers to this. It's not just about spending cuts. There's Ukraine aid that could hop a ride on this. There's other expiring, besides FAA, there's other expiring provisions at the end of the federal fiscal year that the Farm Bill expires. What catches a ride on a CR becomes also another sticking point on the House side, not so much on the Senate. So the politics are crazy. And it's very complicated, much more than we've seen in the recent past. So I think it's just going to be really hard to sort it out and tell. And sometimes I think for those of us who have been around and been through shutdowns before, members themselves kind of have to feel the pain before they're willing to relent on a shutdown and open the government back up. And it just is right now looks where we're headed.
Allie, were you a staffer during the last shutdown?
I was a staffer during some of the brief shutdowns that didn't have any real effect. I was not on the Hill yet in 2013, Annie, but this is reminding me a little bit of 2015 when the end of the Speaker Boehner era,
Yeah.
right? And I was just curious whether not to make you look in a crystal ball, but do you see any way in which there's Speaker McCarthy is able to work across the aisle on this without seeing the end of his speakership?
So one of the most interesting things, so remember, this is what's important about a shutdown, and politically speaking, not policy wise. And I'm happy to talk about the policy because, you know, Allie, it was a good question to you because when you're a federal employee during a shutdown, you don't get paid. There's essential, non-essential. Usually Congress makes a deal where you get your back pay, but you know, Hill staffers aren't paid a lot. Many of the more junior staffers live paycheck to paycheck. And so they just don't get paid and they still have to work. So it's a terrible scenario and it's across the government. But when there's a shutdown, really the power shifts to the administration. And it's up to the White House to decide who's essential and who's non-essential. And they kind of hold the cards during government shutdown because they can really make life miserable for people if they deem many workers non-essential. And that's just the political reality of a shutdown, whether you like it or not. So what happens next if the government shuts down is in the hands of the Biden administration and what they decide to do, who they decide is essential and non-essential. We've seen shutdowns end. You know, the FAA reauthorization expiration that happened in 2013 ended, quite frankly, because there were a lot of delays and senators were sitting and House members were sitting on tarmacs, not being able to get out because the air traffic controllers stopped coming to work because they weren't getting paid. And, you know, that helped bring it to an end because nobody wanted to be sitting on tarmacs. And similar things have happened with government shutdowns where essential services stop and members of Congress start hearing from their constituents about it. I was on the Hill over lunch today with a member who was saying that that member's office has been receiving a lot of phone calls urging for a government shutdown if the federal government budget isn't cut. So this particular office was hearing a lot, you know, from that part of their constituency. And the member was explaining, you know, that their office had a lot of conversations about what it would really mean for their staff and what it means for government workers, you know, government wide, and what a terrible scenario it is, and how there's just not the political clout that those who want the government to shut down because they want these cuts in spending think they're really going to get out of it. They don't wind up getting out of it politically because the average American just gets mad about it. So, you know, it's a tough political calculation here. And McCarthy, again, like I said earlier, he has been quoted as saying, nobody wins with a shutdown. I don't think anyone wins, but the Biden administration holds the cards when it happens. So I think, you know, that'll just be interesting. We've never been through a shutdown with the Biden administration to see how they play it and if they're able to force everybody to the table.
So if you can just maybe remind us about some of these past shutdowns and where we've been in scenarios where we'll assume that a continuing resolution is passed for FAA, right? So we're under authorization, but we have a government shutdown. What will happen then?
So
Mm-hmm.
we don't have all the details yet. We have not gotten the memo. We are usually stakeholders are sent the memo and FAA sends it to them. Deemed essential and essential. So we don't know yet. Typically in the past, what has happened is, you know, air traffic controllers, safety inspectors, anyone with a safety mandate is considered essential. They continue working. They do not get paid. That's part of the problem here is that you work without pay. And at some point in time, it's really worth coming back. And then you have a whole of, you know, more administrative who are not deemed essential to work. You know, and during prolonged shutdowns, so I think the last prolonged one was under the Trump administration. You know, a lot of federal employees look for other jobs. And we have a real crisis with federal employment at the moment with a significant number of vacancies. I'm sure you've all discussed it. You know, airport discussed it a lot about, you know, not being able to fill vacancies at FAA and how that impacts everybody. If there's a prolonged shutdown, what's the incentive for staying? You can get another job paying more money. And so, you know, do you wind up losing a significant portion of the workforce? I mean, real ramifications to think about that are just not about the numbers, that really make government less efficient. And I think that's something that, no one talked about initially. They talk about that in the longer term. And that's a shame, because it makes federal jobs less attractive. And that's like the last thing we need right now. And I see Peter turned his camera on, so I have a feeling I'm going to get a tough question coming from him. No, he's shaking his head no.
No, he's had his camera on. I wouldn't worry about Peter.
Yeah, don't worry about me. Everything Annie says is right.
Oh,
Though Annie's a little bit too optimistic.
about FAA continuing?
Yep. I worry that for reasons totally unrelated to the FAA, they may want to hold this hostage.
I actually asked that question. It doesn't appear to be the case.
Okay, good.
And so our concern in an FAA shutdown is that in 2013, when the last time it happened, and FAA, they extended the FAA reauthorization. This has nothing to do with federal funding, just the reauthorization, because the federal government failed to collect taxes. There was a hole in the budget for FAA, and they filled that hole with AIP funding. So for us, there's real money and real projects at stake. We have an FAA bill, that's passed the House, and one that's being proposed in the Senate that increases AIP to $4 billion. And nobody wants, the leaders of those committees are very supportive of AIP. And I think they're, especially on the House side, where the problems would be, Chairman Graves and Ranking Member Larson are very committed to ensuring this does not happen, because they don't ever want to turn back to AIP to fill the hole. So I am going to give them credit. I mean, they produced a really fantastic bill. They got it through committee with really, the number of amendments that could have been added to it could have been significant. They were not. The House floor added a lot of amendments, nothing that really changed it dramatically for airports. I'm not going to talk about the rest of it, but there's a lot of bipartisanship there, and they felt very optimistic they could get something done. I just don't see a problem in the Senate. So I agree. I was worried about a little hostage holding or holding out at the last minute to try to push a CR, but I think there's too much at stake on an FAA reauthorization bill, and they're not willing to roll the dice on it.
That's the first good news I've heard in about a week. So thank you.
Well, I did just talk to committee staff.
No, that's great. I'm not denying. I'm really happy to hear that.
And I think I wasn't really too worried about it. Then I was like, oh geez, does it get held hostage? But it doesn't appear that way.
Yeah, that's great news, Annie. And that's a good segue to maybe start talking a little bit about FAA reauthorization. In terms of beyond just a short-term extension, is there any sense that things are starting to shake loose in the Senate, or what's the current state of play?
So I wish I had good news on that. And I don't want to say that it's not, because Majority Leader Schumer has said, he thinks that there's floor time for this in November, continues to talk about the importance of an FAA bill. The chairwoman of the committee continues to talk about the importance of an FAA bill. We know that there are a few issues having nothing to do with airports, thank goodness, that are holding it up and that are the logjam right now. The addition of a new FAA administrator nomination, which is most welcome, I think, by the entire aviation industry, and Whitaker has gotten a lot of support from the industry. And we know that Commerce Committee, who has jurisdiction over FAA administrator nominees and has to hold the hearing, are planning on holding one. We're hearing as soon as October. So that is going to jump the line of an FAA bill, as they still behind the scenes try to work out where really is the pilot training hour issue. There are other issues. So what's being reported as pilot training, there are other issues. There are other amendments that are very controversial, that are on the table, that members are pushing, that are not being talked about in the press. So it's not just pilot training, but that's the big one. And I don't know what happens to move that. Both sides are pretty dug in, but I think that at some point in time, Congress has to do something. Yes, they did a debt limit deal. They have not done appropriations the way they should be. We'll see what happens with this CR. FAA is a bipartisan bill, period. it's something they can do. There's something in there for everybody, both on the House side and on the Senate side particularly. It's like a Christmas tree. And so that gives them something to talk about going into the elections. So I'm still optimistic they can get it done. It would be fantastic for the airport industry to have a final bill, given what's in both bills, high priority items that we asked for, the increase in AIP, which we haven't had one in 20 years, to get that in a 5-year period where, you know, we have a bill that lasts 5 years, and then, you know, it's just like thinking ahead on a timeline. So if you get a bill passed, it's not going to happen in 23, but even in 24, well, 5 years later, you're looking at another bill. Those conversations start 3 years in. We've got another crack at more money than whatever other priorities happen within the next few years. This bill is not revolutionary or major. It doesn't change a ton for the entire aviation industry, but does a lot for airports and a lot of stuff we've been asking for a long time. I think we'll be successful in getting in a conference report. So getting it done, I just think is so key for us and really could have a significant impact on airports, but also like really good things. There was a lot of thought put into, especially the House bill. And there's a lot of stuff we asked for still in the Senate bill. So I'm holding out hope we get a bill, because I just think it would be really great for us to clear the decks on this and get it done and implement some of what's in there, see how it goes, and be able to tweak it in short order. You know, usually it takes 10 years to get an FAA bill. So if we can get it done in 5 or 6, it's amazing.
And I know, Annie, we want to get to some of the, you know, top issues for airports that you've seen in both bills so far. But before we get to that, I know I've heard Chairman Sam Graves say he wants to wrap this up by the end of the year. Do you think is there any ability to kind of pre-conference issues to get there, or is that overly ambitious at this point?
No, I don't think so. So the bills are very different. I actually think conference will take a long time when they get there. I mean, some of the things, right, are easy to pre-conference. Like there's if the $4 billion sticks in the Senate bill, there's $4 billion, for AIP. However, the House changes the formulas, the Senate does not. So how do then they have to conference. I mean, that's something that we know a lot about, right, for conferencing, but the bills are very different. The House bill is much longer than the Senate bill. I think it's really hard to pre-conference. It's not quite like appropriations in that respect. So I don't see that. And I don't even see the Senate being able to engage in those conversations with the bill not having passed committee. So yeah, there's an extension, of FAA authorities. My guess is it's only, if I had to bet money, I'd bet money it's 3 months till the end of the year, because the House wants to keep the pressure on the Senate to move their bill. I know FAA wants 6 months. They say they need that for AIP. The reality of it is that even if they got a 6-month FAA reauthorization extension, they won't have 6 months of funding. So I'm not sure it really matters. And so that's a complicated thing, and I'm happy. I don't want to take up your entire call talking about that, but at the end of the day, like, there'll be an extension. I think it's 3 months. See what happens on the funding side, but I don't really know that the 3 months is a detriment to airports, because the funding's just not going to be there anyway. But again, keeping the pressure on the Senate, I think, is key, and getting a final conference report next year would be amazing.
And you've talked about a lot of the things that you think are really great in the House bill that's been passed. What kind of things, as we look forward, even past this reauthorization, are going to be some of your priorities that we still need to look for more changes moving forward? And you can skip over PFCs, I suppose, if you'd like to, or you can bring them up, whatever you'd like to do.
Never given up on PFCs.
Okay.
Handwriting was on the wall for this reauthorization process that it wasn't going to happen. And so we went all in on AIP, and that was obviously so far has paid off, right? But Kevin, I know you have asked me about this when I've the other groups, but from the last bill, something that still hasn't happened is Section 163. And so we do really like what's in the House bill for language, and are hopeful that if there's a conference report, the House language sticks and not the Senate language. Although we do have an amendment in place when the markup happens to fix that, and hopefully that passes. But think that there's opportunities on the regulatory reform side that if they're in a conference report, the things that we've long, wanted out of FAA, that the House listened, and they said that regulatory reform was going to be a priority, and they certainly made it one. So if we could finally, after all these years, get some of those reforms in place and get, and the House bill for AIP does move more into the entitlement part of the program to give airports, more say over the funding that they get. I think that there's some good things that could happen. We can see how that goes and build upon that for the next reauthorization. And then certainly we never give up on PFCs. FAA reauthorizations don't represent the end all be all for trying to get airports more money. There will be things that happen after this FAA reauthorization. We'll closely watch what happens with the highway reauthorization and how they deal with highway trust fund, how they deal with gas tax, how they deal with perhaps vehicle miles traveled, user fee instead. And a lot of those types of issues do impact PFCs or other airport priorities. So we watch all of it. We work with the highway stakeholders all the time, and we'll be doing all of that and looking for opportunities on whatever other priorities exist. But quite frankly, also beyond FAA, and we haven't talked about it, is that there's a lot of security issues facing airports right now. TSA is being very aggressive in their regulatory authority that we don't always like. So I think my team, we're spending lots of time on FAA reauthorization and TSA issues, and that will likely continue as long as TSA continues down the path of unfunded mandates.
Any update on good airports and good jobs, or that bill? Is that continuing on?
Yeah, if you read Politico in the morning, what was in Morning Transportation this morning was factually incorrect. And they have updated some of it in their online edition, not to what made passed my test. But anyway, the good news for that is that so after a lot of great airport lobbying on this issue and explaining to the Hill that the target audience here was not airport employees, and don't go after all of the AIP, IIJA, PFC money, so that airports have to rewrite contracts, for employees that are not ours, about pay and health benefits. We were able to get in the Senate, it has not been introduced, but what was proposed to the Commerce Committee was a modified bill that did not put airports in the middle. The modified bill did require that that the private entities that really the unions were targeting were the ones who would have to, it was directed right at them, and airports were taken out of the middle, which was always our goal from the beginning. It wasn't fair to put us in the middle. So it was not included in the original Senate bill that has been released. I just don't think they have the votes for it. The Republicans are opposed, and with the Senate, makeup being what it is, there's not also full support on the Democratic side either. So I just don't think that they have the votes for the bill that was proposed. Again, one that we're actually neutral on, because it takes us out of it. But it's still a high priority talking point. There's still more protests going on at airports across the country, but airports have mixed reviews they have mixed positions on the modified CINA is
Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Would you mind if we opened up for some audience questions for 5 minutes?
Happy to take them, as always.
Anybody out there have any questions to ask Annie? Hearing none.
If there is a government down, it probably impacts a lot of the it very well could impact some of the consulting work we will do. If the approvals for projects slow down, office managers, but those types of issues are real issues, and I would encourage all of you to contact your member of Congress and tell them how it's impacting the work that you do. I think it's those real life stories that help push government funding to be restored. And I think even if you're like, oh, I know, my member's a Democrat who supports reopening the government, I still think, calling anybody to tell them how it's impacting you as their constituent becomes an important piece. And there are examples that they can use. Or even just telling the staff as they're fielding those phone calls, it just helps. So we're going to need to apply a lot of pressure if there's a government shutdown, especially a prolonged one, to get the government back open, and could very much use your help. I think you guys have even better stories sometimes than we do, because you're the ones really, spearheading the work as the consultants.
Well, great. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. And
Yeah.
fingers crossed for some good days ahead.
Yeah, well, I hope to see some of you at the ACI-NA annual conference in 2 weeks too.
Sounds great. But before we go, we want to invite Andre Titus and Farad Ali to join us now. And they are going to be talking to us about giving us an update on race-neutral legal decisions and laws. Andre, Farad, are you on?
Yeah, I'm here. Unfortunately, Andre had to go back into another meeting to
Oh, no.
go forward. So they left me here to kind of support this work. So thank you all
Well,
for
then
having me.
Andre doesn't get an introduction then. But for Farad here, Farad is from AMAC, and Farad served on the Raleigh-Durham International Airport Authority for 8 years and serves the chair of the AMAC Board of Directors back in 2017. He's currently the chair of the AMAC Government Affairs Committee, which is responsible for monitoring, recommending, preparing, and presenting AMAC's positions on legislative and policy matters affecting its membership. Farad, thank you so much for joining us today and for talking a little bit on this really important issue.
Yeah, I'd like to thank the previous speaker so much. Thank you all for having me and be here with you all. And I'd like to thank the previous speaker for giving us some background, which is really critical to figure out if what the government may do. We know there's lots of levers that may conditionally change what the outcomes may be. But as you all know, AMAC is a strong supporter of the FAA bill and making sure that it's reauthorized. Our main focus is also to make sure that the AIP program's funding is at its full level, and they continue the ACDBE and DBE programs. Without this congressional action, the authority for these programs will expire, and that the reauthorization of these programs are critical to meeting all of our priorities, which we urge our AMAC members to be fully in support of this renewal. So you'll find that our membership is very active in ensuring that the FAA reauthorization is done, and that it has the use of good faith efforts to make sure that we still have ACDBEs and DBEs included in this work. We do recognize that over the past year, there have been some fundamental changes in the Supreme Court that changed the rulings for education. We talk around how that impact is now affecting business and government. It's adversely affected utilization of how they're going to go forth with 8A program. There's been a lawsuit against the Minority Business Development Agency, which is a program of the Department of Commerce. And we actually see private organizations making efforts to stop using ACDBE or minority business programs. And to be honest with you, AMAC is looking at this not from an affirmative action standpoint, but from a competitive action standpoint. We actually think America is less competitive without the utilization of diverse businesses being included for their communities. And so we're trying to focus our efforts to ensuring that we continue to have this economic opportunity to advance our communities. We know ACDBEs are critical in their communities by providing jobs. As we know, people of color typically hire people of color. We know women typically hire women. We also know those are the same people that buy homes. They are tax creators. They pay their taxes, and they provide real big resources in these communities. So again, we don't look at this only from an affirmative action standpoint, but from a competitive action, how we will be less competitive. And not just less competitive within our states and our regions, but less competitive in our country, because we want to make sure that we have producers. And so we look at our business community as critical. And we think that all of our constituents, our business owners and our airports, as well as ACDBEs and DBEs, are supporting this effort, recognizing the changes. A lot of this is being moved from state by state issue, much like other issues are. But we're hoping that there'll be a strong support from all of the aviation community to recognize the importance of the economic impact of diverse businesses on their communities and their airports. And if we drive this wedge in this space, we recognize that this would create even more conversation and really unneeded conversation around separation and disparity and really just not a cultural competency for inclusion. And so when we understand that there's an inclusionary effort provides for more money, we know that diversity of thought has created some of the greatest innovation in America. And we would hate for America not to take advantage of that because they don't want to have inclusion. So that's really the way we're looking at this. Wanted to bring that conversation out loud. We recognize that the Supreme Court has made an education decision on inclusion, but we think it's critical that for the business side of this, that this is an economic issue that we should not shy away from, but come together to make sure that it continues to prosper.
If you don't mind me asking just a couple simple questions that I'm
Yeah.
sure you can answer for us. Is there anything that stops an airport, or what stops an airport from just going on with these programs not at a federal level, if they're using city dollars or something like that, or can they?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question? I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
Just asking about, can an airport on their own continue the policies of an AC DBE program or the DBE program if not using federal dollars?
Yeah, you do have that, Kevin. I appreciate the question. It's sometimes it can be complicated if you don't mind me saying. Some airports are authorities, like the
Sure.
Raleigh-Durham Airport Authority, and some are affiliated with their cities and counties, and some are run by their states. And so, being aware of the condition of what's the infrastructure, the governance structure of your airport, and then determining how to do that. Some airports have decided to disaggregate their dollars by using their AIP dollars because of the grant insurance process, but not using their PFC dollars. And we see that. We also see that there's such a combination because they're already doing so much inclusion with the AIP dollars, they just throw the PFCs inside and just work with it. And some airports recognize the importance of diversity and inclusion and just say, hey, listen, we're just going to be fair to our community, have inclusion, let things be competitive, and then grow our business market. So that's what we have going on right now. Great question.
What can we do as an industry and as members of ACC that can help with this conversation?
Yeah, I think we have to all come together and not get caught up in chasing the idea of what's going on in our polarization of our country, and recognize that we're becoming a more diverse country no matter how you look at it. And diversity is a real issue, right? I tell people that diversity is a fact. We're all diverse, even on this call, for whatever that reason may be. But inclusion is going to be critical because as we start looking at how we're going to be competitive in the future, looking at the geopolitical issues that we have going on currently, if you just look at the actuary chart of the people who are in Congress, how that's going to change real soon. If not, and I say actuary charts, if not by age, about the change of the new leaders that are coming into play. And we want to have a business community that's receptive to change. Otherwise, it will be drastic. And we don't want to have, knowing that we have a more diverse community coming up in the next generation, I think it would be wise for us in business to be prepared for that, providing the inclusion so that we don't have to make laws and rules that seem so stark, but recognizing the importance of inclusion and equity in that space.
That's great. Any questions from any of our members on the call for Rod?
Well, either I put everybody to sleep or it was a job well done. So I'm
Yeah, I don't know. That's the trouble with being in the afternoon right after lunch, perhaps. I don't know, but we certainly appreciate you joining us and talking about this issue. And hopefully this is a place where we can partner together with AMAC to make sure that we can protect these policies and laws and see what we can do together. So let's keep the conversation going.
Hey, thank you so much. And thanks for having us participate.
Of course. And so that's our program for today. I just want to discuss really quickly as we get closer to the end of September, we're just going to have to keep an eye on how things are going. And hopefully Annie's correct in that FAA reauthorization continuing resolution will not take a hit over the next couple of weeks, and we will see that continuing resolution. But in the case that we are getting close to that deadline and we're not seeing it, the advocacy committee hopes to get some clarifications from FAA, and maybe we can get a speaker next week or the week after that can discuss a little bit more with us what it might mean if we are not only in a government shutdown, but also in a case where we don't have that authorization as well. So stay tuned. We also, I think it's very possible that in the coming weeks, we might have to have a call to action and to tell our lawmakers that we really need this to be taken care of and solved, and that we have to vote to keep our government from shutting down. So please stay tuned. We will be in touch. If anybody has any questions about anything we've talked about today, please reach out to myself or to Allie or to Amanda. We'd be happy to talk more about it. We love talking about this stuff. Reach out to me if you'd like to get more involved with the committee, especially if you are a YP on this call and interested in this sort of stuff, and would be interested in becoming our YP liaison moving forward for next year. We'd love to have you. Otherwise, have a very nice Monday, a very nice week, and we will talk to you again soon. Thank you for joining us.